In this video we continue with our exploration of Christian Gnosis in German philosophy of religion. We began with famous German mystic Jacob Boehme and his influence on Schelling. Now we continue with Schleiermacher, as a kind of response to that previous video, and in the next video we will finish this discussion with Hegel. All these thinkers are deeply connected, and their religious views are a kind of continuation of ancient Gnosis. Even if it is the case that they accidentally produced these similarities, this connection is very interesting and worth exploring. Schleiermacher's doctrine of faith is the next remarkable phenomenon that appears within the field under examination. The reason for placing his work on Christian doctrine alongside Schelling's Doctrine of God follows from the course already taken. Even if Schleiermacher's emphatic rejection of the idea that his doctrine of faith contains a philosophical foundation for the Christian faith is accepted, it must nevertheless be acknowledged that this famous work is epoch-making not only in the history of Christian dogmatics, but equally in the history of the philosophy of religion. Although the content of the Christian faith should scarcely be grounded in philosophy, a science of the Christian faith, even according to Schleiermacher, can only be developed philosophically, through philosophical methods and certain philosophical elements that theology receives into itself and works with. Yet this scientific procedure is precisely the same as that already encountered as religious philosophy, or gnosis. The absolute concept of religion is reached only by becoming conscious of the moments through which religion is mediated. Schleiermacher's doctrine of faith, therefore, has the twofold task of comprehending the religious absolute in its purity, while simultaneously becoming conscious of the moments through which the absolute concept of religion is mediated. The distinctive character of Schleiermacher's position becomes clear immediately in its decisive opposition to Schelling's standpoint. Here the absolute does not mediate itself with itself. Rather, everything belonging to mediation is confined to the standpoint of the knowing subject. Nothing more clearly expresses the subjectivity of Schleiermacher's position than its opposition to the objectivity of Schelling's. Schelling had few reservations about positing a duality of principles and a real distinction within the divine nature itself, and therefore had no hesitation in allowing the divine nature to mediate itself with itself through a succession of moments. In other words, from this standpoint Schelling could scarcely avoid subjecting the divine nature to a temporal process of development. Schleiermacher, by contrast, strictly excludes all such determinations from the concept of the divine nature. For him, in the idea of God, everything temporal and concrete must be avoided if what is purely subjective is not to be treated as objective. In itself, nothing seems more natural or necessary than this demand. Yet the strictness with which Schleiermacher consistently applies it carries the position directly toward the opposite extreme from Schelling. Thus, whereas Schelling accepts concrete determinations in order to preserve the conception of a living God rather than reduce the concept of God to an empty abstraction, Schleiermacher's concept of God, stripped of everything concrete and humanly subjective, would become merely an abstraction, the abstract sum and substance of all those relations which, grounded in the feeling of absolute dependence, converge in the concept of an absolute causality. The absolute is initially posited only in the immediacy of feeling, as the feeling of absolute dependence. Only upon this foundation do the positive determinations follow that constitute the concept of God. The most distinctive feature of Schleiermacher's doctrine of faith is that the divine attributes determining the concept of God are simply the objective expressions corresponding to the various aspects and conditions of the feeling of absolute dependence. As Schleiermacher expresses the point, all attributes ascribed to God signify not something particular in God himself, but only something particular in the way the feeling of utter dependence is related to him. Otherwise God would have to be conceived as consisting of a multiplicity of functions, as occurs in finite life. Since such functions, once understood as particular functions, would stand alongside one another and partly exclude one another, God would thereby fall into the realm of antitheses. This restriction also means that nothing can be attributed to God that would make divine activity appear, in a human manner, to alternate with states of rest. From this standpoint, therefore, there can be no question of a beginning of the world or of a creation of the world. Instead, the entire relation between God and the world is something of which human beings become conscious only because the feeling of dependence is related to their position within the universal nexus of nature. since self-consciousness simultaneously contains an awareness of the totality of finite being. The same feeling of utter dependence that forms a general element of individual self-consciousness is likewise applied to the condition of the totality of finite being. Likewise, no distinction or antithesis of any kind can be posited within God on account of the existence of sin. According to God's dispensation and will, sin is real and necessary for human beings, since apart from God consciousness and the recognition produced by it of a divine will that commands and forbids, there can be no sin. Yet sin does not stand before God in the same way as those things that human beings simply regard as deserving rejection, as though they possessed the same character for God as they do for humanity, since God has no indirect knowledge. For God, there is no sin in and for itself. Sin exists for God only in relation to redemption, since redemption itself could not be ordained by God unless sin were at the same time ordained by God. Sin therefore exists only insofar as it is simultaneously subsumed under redemption. The entire antithesis between sin and redemption does not exist for God. According to this view, the divine attributes are nothing other than the different ways in which the feeling of absolute dependence is related to an absolute causality, since what is dependent cannot be conceived apart from that on which it depends. If the presentation of the one and undivided divine causality through a plurality of divine attributes is regarded merely as a human mode of thought, then this view reaches its completion by rejecting every distinction concerning the divine being within the doctrine of the Trinity. The assumption of eternal divisions within the Supreme Being cannot be derived from a pious self-consciousness. It cannot proceed from such consciousness, since there is no sufficient basis for maintaining that the impression made by the divine in Christ was intended to affirm an eternal division within God as its foundation. The divine in Christ therefore refers only to absolute divine causality as such, and in Christ it likewise represents only a particular relation of the feeling of absolute dependence to that causality. Since God consciousness, understood as the feeling of absolute dependence, can become actual only in connection with a sensible determination of self-consciousness, and since the relation of sensible consciousness to God consciousness can vary in different ways, there must consequently be a possible relation between sensible consciousness and God consciousness in which God consciousness, as the higher form of self-consciousness, remains permanently steadfast. Because this possibility belongs to the original perfection of human nature, Christ is therefore the consummated creation of human nature, precisely because in him the God consciousness accompanying self-consciousness possesses absolute power. This constant power of his God consciousness can also be expressed by saying that God is actually present or has being within him. The unity of the divine and the human, the God-man character as it appears in Christ, is therefore that very intensity of God consciousness in which consciousness itself can simply be understood as the being or presence of God. The standpoint from which this concept arises is, as with the divine attributes, the feeling of utter dependence. The divine element in Christ is not something particular existing within God. Rather, it is absolute divine causality itself, to which the feeling of absolute dependence continually leads, insofar as this divine causality fills and determines the whole of a human being's self-consciousness. Thus, on one side there is being or presence, while on the other there is consciousness. Yet being is present only insofar as consciousness itself presupposes that being, just as the feeling of absolute dependence presupposes absolute divine causality. If the divine in Christ were described as the absolute at the point where it attaches itself to self-consciousness in the form of his human consciousness, this would simply constitute an objective way of viewing the matter. That perspective must instead be transformed into subjective terms. Accordingly, the divine in Christ is precisely that God consciousness, or consciousness of the absolute, which, within the unity of his own self-consciousness, presupposes the being or presence of God, or of the absolute. Therefore, this position strictly excludes everything that presupposes an objective distinction within the being or nature of God. The general view underlying Schleiermacher's doctrine of faith has often been designated as pantheism, and there can be no doubt that it is in any case very closely connected with pantheism. If every view that understands the relation of the finite to the infinite deterministically, and regards the world as immanently related to God, is properly called pantheistic, then Schleiermacher's position must be placed within this perspective. where absolute divine causality and the feeling of absolute dependence stand simply as counterparts, there is no room for freedom in the indeterminist sense. When God and the world, according to Schleiermacher, are ultimately distinguished only in that God is the absolute and undivided oneness, while the world, although posited as a unity, is nevertheless a divided and disjointed unity, at once containing the totality of contrasts and differences together with all the manifold determinations arising from them, God and world still remain two essentially different concepts. Yet their difference is only of the kind by which the world must likewise be distinguished from God in Spinozism. Nevertheless, it is equally correct to maintain that Schleiermacher's standpoint is directly opposed to pantheism. Pantheism can take only an objective standpoint and begin with the concept of absolute substance as what is immediately given. All its determinations concerning the being or nature of God consequently possess an objective character. They are not merely abstractions derived from the various relations that can be distinguished within human religious consciousness. Rather, the Absolute itself is understood as reflecting itself in human consciousness. Schleiermacher, by contrast, reaches the concept of God solely from the subjectivity of the feeling of dependence. Thus what speculative thought regards as the objectivity of the concept appears for Schleiermacher as the immediacy of feeling or consciousness. These are therefore two opposed orientations and modes of viewing things. One proceeds, as it were, from above downward, turning toward subjectivity only on the basis of objectivity. The other proceeds in the opposite direction, from below upward, arriving at objectivity on the basis of subjectivity. Yet the point at which both ultimately meet is the same. The individual being is completely determined. Schleiermacher firmly maintains the abstract concept of an absolute causality that excludes all concrete elements of life in God, so that there can scarcely be any talk here of mediating moments. Instead, the way his Christian doctrine has the feeling of dependence, or the religious consciousness, mediate itself with itself directly expresses what must be regarded as the essential character of this religious philosophy. Christianity is understood as the absolute religion through the idea of redemption. Yet the concept of the absolute religion can only be reached critically, by carefully distinguishing and defining the different forms assumed and traversed by the feeling of dependence until, at the highest stage of its development, it takes the form of Christianity. This requires tracing the specifically Christian element back to the general religious aspect, analyzing the feeling of dependence through its various moments in order to determine the place that belongs to the Christian element as its particular sphere. This undertaking does not, in an a priori manner, seek to explain Christianity as a historical phenomenon from the religious stages that preceded it, although the investigation, in accordance with its genetic concept, necessarily presupposes those stages. This understanding of Christianity, by placing it within the framework it shares with the history of related religions, is one of the greatest and finest features of Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine. It retains this feature even though, in the second edition, the cautious revision of the work removed everything stated in the first edition about the necessity of going beyond Christianity and taking a standpoint beyond Christianity, in order to prevent the appearance of placing philosophy above Christianity, and to recognize and distinguish what Christianity shares with other forms of faith, and through which it rises above them. Only by maintaining this unitary perspective can the various forms of religion perhaps be understood as the different moments in which the feeling of absolute dependence mediates itself with itself. If religion, or piety, is defined as the feeling of absolute dependence, then every individual form of religion must be regarded as a moment in which this general concept increasingly seeks to realize itself. It is evident that religious forms that have not yet attained monotheism occupy little significance in this development. As long as self-consciousness had not expanded into a universal consciousness of the world, religious life could express absolute dependence only upon an individual finite being, rather than upon the world as a whole. The feeling of absolute dependence was therefore not yet as comprehensive as it must be when the absolute is understood as the absolutely determinative factor. Monotheism, the belief in one supreme God upon whom everything finite, and the world in its fullest extent, depends, consequently constitutes an important epoch in this development. Even within this stage, however, different forms appear, representing different versions of the same function or mission. When monotheism still takes a polytheistic form, it is the monotheism of nature religion. The multiplicity of gods subordinated to the one supreme God arises from the manifold ways in which natural life presents itself. The feeling of absolute dependence is directed toward one supreme being upon whom everything finite is understood to depend. The inadequacy of this view lies in the fact that the dependent finite reality is initially only the natural world. There is not yet a consciousness of the distinction between natural life and the ethical and personal life of the human being, nor of how this human life is to be understood. With Jewish monotheism, the feeling of absolute dependence concerns not only nature, but also human life as distinguished from natural life. Yet just as nature serves paganism as the medium through which this feeling is expressed, in Judaism that medium is the state. Thus Judaism likewise leaves another sphere standing apart from the absolute element upon which the human being feels utterly dependent. That sphere is the inner, ethical, and religious life. Christianity first brings this sphere to consciousness and, through the consciousness of sin, reveals the innermost need to unite consciousness of sin with God consciousness. In Christianity, therefore, the feeling of absolute dependence is realized for the first time in its fullness. Accordingly, just as absolute spirit, viewed from another perspective, works through the various forms of religion in order to mediate itself with itself and arrive at a clear concept of itself, so here the feeling of absolute dependence passes through its various moments so that, through the continual negation of these mediating moments, it may become what is absolutely determinative. These two different religious forms and stages are related to one another in the same way when they are characterized according to the persons who founded them. Alongside the features that each religion shares with other religious forms, Judaism and Christianity each possess something original and distinctive. For that reason, each can enter human consciousness all at once as a complete whole, so that the entire individuality of each religion appears immediately in its founder. The distinguishing feature of the religion of nature is that its religious consciousness remains largely interwoven with and incorporated into consciousness of nature, leaving little awareness of a specific founder. Nothing, however, is more characteristic of Judaism and Christianity than the originality with which Christ stands apart from Moses, that is, Moses' standpoint in relation to Christ and Christ's absolute standpoint. Yet the inner connection between Moses' position as the prototype and Christ's absolute, archetypal position must not be overlooked. Sin and redemption are the two elements through which the feeling of dependence mediates itself with itself. From the standpoint of Christian consciousness, however, this antithesis is not immediately given, but itself undergoes mediation. There is an aspect of the Christian feeling of dependence in which the antithesis of sin and redemption has not yet appeared, at least not in its sharpest form. This occurs where God consciousness affects the human being only superficially, without the person yet experiencing the limitation caused by the incapacity of sin. It occurs when people awaken to an awareness of their existence within the universal nexus of nature, so that their self-consciousness embraces the consciousness of all finite things as a totality and a whole. In this way, self-consciousness expands into consciousness of the world as a whole. The antithesis of God and world is therefore the presupposition of the antithesis of sin and redemption. For this reason, the first part of Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine develops the feeling of dependence in its relation to self-consciousness as expanded into world consciousness, while the second part advances to the actual contents of Christian consciousness, namely, the antithesis of sin and redemption, the God consciousness bound by sin and then liberated from that bondage. It is here that the relation of this Christian doctrine to the concept of religious philosophy, and consequently also to ancient Gnosis, can first be considered more specifically. According to Schleiermacher, Christianity is the absolute religion because it is the religion of redemption. Christ is therefore the Redeemer. He is the Redeemer because the bondage of the feeling of utter dependence, which makes a liberating orientation of God consciousness impossible for all other people, is completely abolished in him. He consequently possesses the power to redeem all those who, unlike him, must be regarded as in need of redemption. This is the archetypal feature that essentially distinguishes him from every other human being. More precisely, It is the constancy of his God consciousness, expressed outwardly in his infallibility and sinlessness. A question immediately arises, however, when Schleiermacher defines Christianity more specifically as the absolute religion by saying that it is essentially distinguished from other monotheistic faiths through the fact that everything in it is related to the redemption accomplished through Jesus of Nazareth. The question is what justifies identifying this person, Jesus of Nazareth, with redemption in such a way that the concepts necessarily attributed to the Redeemer are also understood to belong to Jesus of Nazareth. Even if dogmatics must here rely upon auxiliary arguments supplied by apologetic, it remains evident that proving Jesus of Nazareth to be the Redeemer in the indicated sense can never be accomplished by empirical means. What evidence could history, understood through the Gospel account, provide that he is absolutely sinless? Historical examination can establish only what is best in a relative sense. Between what is relatively best and what is absolutely perfect, however, there remains a gulf that history can never cross. Consequently, Jesus of Nazareth is either called the Redeemer only in an indefinite sense that allows for various interpretations, or it is the philosophy of religion, through the path of speculation, that reaches the true and proper concept of the Redeemer, and then assigns this concept to the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. If the latter is the only adequate explanation, then the philosophy of religion alone recognizes and secures for Christianity the stature and significance it possesses as the absolute religion. Since the concept of the Redeemer is the truly dominant factor, whose normative and organizing influence extends throughout the entire content of Christian dogmatics, including Schleiermacher's Christian Doctrine, this makes clear the relation of Christianity as a historically given religion to the philosophy of religion. In other words, it reveals the relation between the historical Christ and the ideal Christ. The results are similar in the case of the Gnostics. On the one hand, there was the separation of Christ from Jesus, which divided the one historical individual into two entirely heterogeneous halves. On the other hand, there was the critical procedure by which the Gnostics sought to remove all objectionable Jewish elements from the documents of the New Testament. The guiding idea behind this procedure was the concept of the Redeemer as it had taken shape for them, not through a merely empirical process, but in part even in opposition to the historical account. The analogy with Schleiermacher lies in the relationship he establishes between the archetypal aspect and the historical aspect of the Redeemer. If this way of designating Christ is, in itself, preferred to the usual formulation according to which the divine and human natures are united in one person, then the distinction between an archetypal Christ and a historical Christ is further supported by the specifications attached to these two concepts. Schleiermacher firmly and consistently maintains the archetypal character of the Redeemer, and carries this idea through in order to place him above all others, as the founder of a corporate life or fellowship encompassing every other form of pious association. Everything existing outside this fellowship is consequently regarded as an imperfect or incomplete religious life. On the other hand, the entire treatment of the historical concept of the Redeemer tends to place him on the same level as other human beings. Not only is the purely historical aspect of the Redeemer's person presented as a popular elaboration, expressed through conceptions appropriate to the religious sphere, such as ideas of angels and demons. Everything else connected with the person of the Redeemer, miracles such as his supernatural conception, resurrection, ascension, second coming, and final judgment, is likewise treated as something that must be distinguished from the proper elements of the doctrine of his person. In this way, room is left for conceiving the Redeemer himself, in all these circumstances, as no different from ordinary human beings. In general, this must be regarded as the position that applies to the factors concerning the person of the Redeemer. The position must be considered from two sides. First, in relation to the New Testament testimonies available on the subject, and second, in relation to its dogmatic value. This position leaves such extensive room for ingenious criticism and interpretation that the danger it might create on the path toward the results of historical criticism, and thereby its possible harmful effect upon the standing of Christianity, can only be adequately prevented by assuming that the standing of the Redeemer would in any event remain secure within its proper sphere, independently of the historical narrative. Yet what would follow if the miraculous element in the Redeemer's appearance were understood precisely as the fact that Jesus, the man, was regarded as archetypal, that the archetype was historically and actually present in him, so that he became the founder of a new corporate life. Two essentially different ways of understanding this would then present themselves, and they could never be completely reconciled. The reason is that the ahistorical, archetypal Redeemer remains forever at a height inaccessible to historical knowledge, transcending the historical sphere in much the same way that, among the Gnostics in their unsophisticated and unscientific treatment of the matter, the connection between Christ and Jesus appears as a very loose and external relation, or even as one that has been completely severed. The objection is therefore not directed against the unavoidable conclusion reached by Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine concerning the Redeemer, but against the procedure through which that conclusion is reached. The role played by the philosophy of religion in the entire internal organization of this Christian doctrine should have been openly acknowledged, and the speculative element should have been more clearly distinguished from the historical element in its presentation. For that reason, further investigation of this Christian doctrine along the lines of its philosophy of religion should not be abandoned. From the standpoint of a philosophy of religion in which speculative thinking stands above a merely historical understanding, the complete development of the concept of the supernatural element in the Redeemer shows that Schleiermacher's definition ultimately excludes what is utterly supernatural and what is actually miraculous, since the supernatural is once again understood together with the natural factor. Yet it belongs to the nature of the philosophy of religion to oppose miracle in the proper sense, because miracle breaks apart the context in which the concept must operate through the successive moments of its own self-determination, according to the immanent laws of its own movement. Thus, in relation to the Redeemer, the philosophy of religion can scarcely be satisfied with any concept other than that of his archetypal character. Yet it would seriously misunderstand its task if, because of this archetypal character, it sought to remove the Redeemer entirely from the sphere of human development rather than attempting to comprehend his likeness within that sphere. Schleiermacher's well-known thesis in his Christian doctrine, according to which the appearing of Christ and the establishment of a new corporate life through him are to be understood as the completion of the creation of human nature, most clearly acknowledges this demand of the philosophy of religion to treat the Redeemer as belonging within the human realm. The appearing of the Redeemer was therefore indeed the first creation of humankind, although through this creation, implanted in humankind in a non-temporal manner, the incomplete or imperfect condition of human nature became manifest. In this way, the appearing of the Redeemer within humanity is immediately recognized as something necessary, since all other human beings stand in relation to the Redeemer as lesser degrees stand in relation to the highest degree, which is perfect in itself. As Schleiermacher maintains, if the possibility of continued progress in the potency of God consciousness is accepted while denying that its perfection exists anywhere, then it can no longer be maintained that the creation of humankind has been or will be completed. For as progress continues, perfection is always posited only as a possibility. This is the case whenever perfection is contained in the concept of an essential function of life, but is not realized in the individual instance. Consequently, despite the archetypal character that raises the Redeemer absolutely above all others, the distinction between the Redeemer and other human beings remains a distinction of degree. He is distinguished from them because the same orientation of God consciousness toward the absolute that appears in others only relatively has become in him the absolute efficacy and constancy of God consciousness. The highest degree is, of course, essentially different from every lesser degree, even if the difference consists only in being 1 degree higher. This can be understood as the Redeemer's specific and relatively greater dignity or rank. Through this specific dignity, the Redeemer stands alone in his kind, and remains so forever in degree, yet he is still first among equals. These two concepts are not mutually exclusive, because each is completely true only in and through the presupposition of the other. Specific dignity means that a difference of degree, which always leaves open the possibility that someone better might appear through another religion, does not fully express the essential nature of the Redeemer, since that essential nature must be understood as necessarily unique and remaining unique. Relative dignity, on the other hand, means that despite this uniqueness, the founder nevertheless belongs to the human species. Since it is essential to this species that every individual be pious, human piety relates everything to him, regarding all such relations as different levels of the religious relationship and assigning to him the highest level. This is essentially the same view held by ancient Gnosis, when it presupposes in all those whom the Redeemer draws to himself a spiritual principle related to the Redeemer, and when the souls in which this principle has appeared in perfect purity are placed in the same relation to the Redeemer as the bride is to the bridegroom. Here the relation of Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine to the philosophy of religion, or philosophical theology, becomes fully evident and appears in its proper light. The idea of the absolute infallibility and sinlessness of the Redeemer, or the idea of his archetypal character, is certainly not obtained through a merely empirical process. Yet the idea of his archetypal character, when the creation of the human being is said to be incomplete, cannot simply be posited within the concept of him. This truth must also be realized in an individual. The question, therefore, arises as to how idea and reality are related in this case. Is the archetypal feature originally given only in the idea, and therefore lacking reality? Or is it originally given in historical reality, and therefore merely empirical in origin, lacking the significance of the idea? Schleiermacher does not provide a further explanation of this problem at the point where one would initially expect it. Since he attributes an archetypal character to the Redeemer and, on the basis of the historical account, identifies Jesus of Nazareth as the Redeemer, these two determinations together presuppose that Jesus of Nazareth is both archetypal and historical. The issue therefore cannot be avoided, and Schleiermacher addresses it in his doctrine of the person of Christ by asking whether the archetypal element in Christ might also be understood merely as exemplary, as a model or prototype. Since the power or efficacy of God consciousness within corporate life always remains incomplete, an exemplary dignity or role must certainly belong to the Redeemer. But the archetypal character that expresses the actual being or presence of the concept itself, and therefore absolute perfection or completeness, would not apply to him, since such perfection would not be necessary for understanding a result that remains perpetually incomplete. Perhaps this could be regarded as the original exaggeration of believers who, recognizing their own imperfection, conceive Christ in an increasingly hyperbolic manner as the embodiment of perfection. Throughout the ages, believers have endowed Jesus with whatever they were able to understand as archetypal within this sphere. 2 points, however, stand against this interpretation. First, if individuals subordinate their personal consciousness to the concept of the species, there must arise the hope that humankind, at some future time, even if only through its noblest and finest members, will surpass Christ and leave him behind. Such a consequence would plainly impose limits upon the Christian faith. Second, if it is remembered that the creation of human beings cannot remain incomplete, while at the same time recognizing how difficult it is to distinguish between a genuine archetype and an exemplary being or prototype possessing the power to produce every possible enhancement of the whole fellowship, then it becomes clear that archetypal character is the appropriate expression for the exclusive and personal dignity of Jesus. For the production of this enhancement belongs to the concept of the archetype itself, rather than to that of a mere model or prototype. The main issue is clearly determined by the second of these 2 points. The question ultimately concerns whether the productive effect contained in the concept of the archetype can also be ascribed to the model or prototype. If archetype and prototype are identified in this respect through the idea of productive efficacy, then this productive effect cannot be found merely in the outward, perceptible appearance of the Redeemer. It must be admitted that his appearing, or perceptible presence, by itself in no way provides the true concept of sinlessness or archetypal character. If the entire concept of the Redeemer depended only upon his external appearance as a historical phenomenon, then the resurrection and ascension should likewise not be regarded as essential parts of the doctrine of the person of the Redeemer. Rather, the productive power belonging to the archetypal character would depend upon faith in the reality of these events, unless the same reasoning were also used to deprive belief in the reality of the Redeemer's earthly life of its significance, insofar as that life is accessible to empirical knowledge. The issue here concerns the concepts of being and existence, and the distinction between the finite and the absolute in relation to these concepts. It belongs to the concept of God that God must be thought of as existing, and that God's being is included within the concept of God. The same must therefore apply to the absolute in every context. Only on this basis can Schleiermacher, when speaking of Christ, call the divine element in Christ, the very element that constitutes his archetypal character, a God consciousness that is itself a being or presence of God within him. Therefore, if the archetypal is identified with the absolute, existence cannot be connected with the archetypal merely in a temporary or passing way, because the concept of the archetypal necessarily includes its being. Independently of its outward historical appearance, what is archetypal possesses its reality within itself. Consequently, it cannot be maintained that creation remains incomplete until what is archetypal appears historically in an individual person, leaving open the possibility that humanity might at some future point surpass Christ. If concept and being are identical in what is archetypal, then nothing further can be added to it. Creation is complete because the archetypal can become an object of consciousness in a form that expresses the essence of the human being. The archetypal human being, that is, the God-man, possesses objective reality in his concept. Yet this reality is located in the historical existence of a particular individual, and through this historical existence the reality becomes subjective. Thus the objective reality of the archetypal exists precisely within the sphere of consciousness. In other words, it possesses an ideal significance. In considering the internal organization of Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine, attention has already been drawn to the fact that he understands the propositions established in that doctrine as belonging to several different kinds. Some describe the conditions of human life, some concern the divine attributes and modes of divine activity, and some express characteristics of the world. Yet he expressly maintains that the essential point is that the propositions belonging to the latter two kinds contain nothing that is not also contained in the first. Strictly speaking, the first kind is sufficient for completing the analysis of Christian piety, and it would therefore be preferable to develop this form alone, since the others serve only as means by which its true dogmatic significance can be understood. Nevertheless, these other forms cannot simply be excluded from Christian doctrine, because doing so would deprive it of its historical position and consequently of its ecclesial character. This distinctive construction of Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine therefore provides a deeper insight into its inner nature. If the whole doctrine were reduced to propositions describing only the conditions of human life, religious feeling would be understood as something developing entirely from within itself, consisting of a succession of inner states of the soul or disposition. The entire doctrine of the person of Christ would likewise become merely a description of a condition of human life, namely, the condition of redemption. The Redeemer would then be nothing other than the idea of redemption conceived as personal in him and fixed upon his person. In place of the historical Christ would stand the ideal Christ, the archetypal Christ, in whom the perfect God consciousness that produces redemption appears as being or presence, so that human God consciousness becomes the being or presence of God within human nature. Such a view cannot be regarded as excluded by Schleiermacher's own statements against it. He argues that if human nature before Christ, and independently of him, were thought to possess the power of producing within itself a pure and perfect archetype, then, because reason and will are naturally connected, human nature could not have existed in a universally sinful condition. In the first edition of his Christian faith, Schleiermacher likewise indicates that this position assumes Christ, as presented in faith, to be truly archetypal. Yet the appearing of the Son of God is understood there as having been everywhere a spiritual appearing within human souls, since in history the Son of God could not have appeared in an external individual person. At this point, Schleiermacher's concept of miracle must also be considered, and the objection raised by Carl Nietzsche cannot be accepted as correct. He argues that the production of the archetype through and within a sinful orientation would not constitute a union of the natural and the supernatural, but rather of the unnatural with its opposite. That would indeed be the case only if the archetype itself was supposed to be produced by the sinful orientation, which is not the position being maintained. Schleiermacher's concept of miracle necessarily implies that a sinful orientation is not an absolute obstacle to the production of the archetype. According to Schleiermacher, if the Redeemer, considered as the historical man Jesus, is to be regarded as a miraculous appearance because his specifically spiritual substance cannot be derived from the substance of the human sphere of life to which he belonged, but instead proceeds from the universal source of spiritual life through a creative divine act, in which, as the greatest act, The concept of the human being as the subject of God consciousness is perfected, then the same must also apply to the archetypal nature of Christ when it is understood as a production of the human soul. The objection, however, must be made on an entirely different ground. If the archetypal character of Christ, or the Redeemer, is understood as a production of the human soul in the sense indicated, it nevertheless cannot be reproduced as the same miracle in every individual soul in which it becomes conscious. It is a miracle only where it first and originally came into being. Thus the inquiry is continually led back to a historical starting point. This is what Schleiermacher means when he observes in his second letter concerning the Christian doctrine that the feeling of the need for redemption is certainly a particular form of the feeling of dependence. Yet Christianity cannot for that reason be deduced from this feeling. It can only be said that, through the vitality of this feeling, Christianity arose when Christ appeared and was recognized in his glory and power. The Christ within always presupposes the historical Christ. Accordingly, although the descriptions of the condition of the human soul that constitute the first kind of dogmatic propositions can be derived directly from inner experience, this experience is at the same time understood as determined by the religious community to which the individual belongs. But when the investigation goes back to the beginning of this community and to its founder, who in this capacity is the Redeemer, the same difficulty continually returns. Since the Redeemer is presented as a historical person, he cannot be known historically or empirically as the subject of perfect God consciousness, that is, in his archetypal character and absolute sinlessness. What empirical evidence could establish this? What evidence of this kind could a Christian doctrine provide, especially when it declares that the otherwise significant proofs, such as miracles and prophecies, are entirely untenable? On the other hand, it remains equally certain that the idea of the Redeemer is connected with his person, and that consciousness of this idea arises from his person as its mediator. The contradiction can therefore be resolved only by recognizing that the idea of his archetypal character possesses its truth not in the historical phenomenon to which it is principally connected for human consciousness, but solely in itself. Yet once people have become conscious of this idea as something true in itself, they must also recognize that it can enter consciousness in no other way than through the mediation of that historical phenomenon. Ideality and historical reality are therefore reciprocally related. This is simply the familiar antithesis between the ideal and the real, the relation within which all human thinking and knowing takes place. The idea possesses its truth within itself. It is true not because it is externally given, but through the reason that knows it. Nevertheless, consciousness of the idea cannot arise apart from the constant interrelation of the ideal and the real. In the same way, the concept of God necessarily includes God's existence, yet without consciousness of the world there would be no God consciousness. This does not mean, however, that the real, which mediates consciousness of the idea and is naturally and necessarily connected with it, is therefore incorporated into the idea itself, so that the two become one. The same applies to the archetypal Christ and the historical Christ. For this reason, insofar as Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine must also be understood as religious philosophy, it resembles ancient Gnosis in that the archetypal Christ and the historical Christ do not readily come together in a complete and indivisible unity. In each of its forms, this philosophy of religion must also determine the relation of Christianity to Judaism and paganism. The Christian doctrine addresses this question through the well-known thesis that Christianity indeed has a special historical connection with Judaism because Jesus was born among the Jewish people, but that, with respect to its historical existence and its purpose, its relation to Judaism is the same as its relation to paganism. Several circumstances, however, serve to balance Christ's Jewish origin. Above all, a much greater number of pagans than Jews converted to Christianity. Moreover, Christianity would hardly have been received so favorably by the Jews had their dispersion to Babylon not already made them receptive to foreign influences. These considerations therefore indicate that Judaism and paganism stand in a fully comparable relation to Christianity, since both supplied converts who entered Christianity by leaving behind what had previously belonged to them. Christianity, consequently, cannot be regarded as continuous with Judaism any more than with paganism. The elements of the Old Testament that are most specifically Jewish consequently possess the least value. What can be found reproduced in the Old Testament are chiefly those expressions of piety that have a more general character and do not develop themes that are distinctly Christian. Taken as a whole, they certainly recall corresponding features found among the nobler and purer elements of paganism. In his second letter concerning the Christian doctrine, Schleiermacher spoke in the same spirit against the belief that the Jewish people possessed a special inspiration and revelation from God, and also against the idea that belief in God's revelation in Christ in any way depends upon such a belief concerning the Jews. The conviction that Christianity possesses sufficient vitality in its own development and requires no support from Judaism is as old as Christianity's own religious consciousness. For that reason, attempts to prove Christianity through prophecy are never especially successful. Great reliance upon such external proofs can simply be understood as evidence of insufficient confidence in Christianity's inner power. Those who possess a fuller understanding should therefore free themselves from dependence upon the imperfect character and meager elements of the Old Covenant. These positions make especially clear the fundamental standpoint upon which this view rests. Schleiermacher's feeling of dependence leaves Christianity with no standpoint other than subjectivity. Immediate Christian consciousness, therefore, becomes the sole criterion by which the value of all phenomena of religious life is determined. It follows naturally that historical elements are likewise divided, within the single antithesis of Christian consciousness, between what agrees with this consciousness and what contradicts it. From this perspective, whatever does not express the fullness of Christian consciousness is, for that very reason, not Christian. This also explains why the more strongly something belongs to the distinctive character of Jewish religion, and the more it separates itself from the freer and more universal monotheism found in certain forms of paganism through its anthropomorphism and anthropopathism, the less compatible it becomes with a theology whose essential character consists in avoiding every objective determination of the nature or being of God. Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine therefore displays a consistent antipathy toward Judaism, particularly in its treatment of the relation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the history of religious philosophy, there is scarcely any notable parallel to this position except the antinomianism of Marcion, which rests upon a wholly analogous standpoint. At this point in the development of more recent religious philosophy, Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone becomes especially relevant. Consistency with Schleiermacher's principles can ultimately be shown to rest upon a Kantian foundation. A comparison of the two thinkers therefore helps illuminate Schleiermacher's mystical obscurity through Kant's intellectual clarity. The two principles that Schleiermacher distinguishes as sensible consciousness and God consciousness correspond to what Kant calls the evil principle and the good principle. Kant's evil principle, insofar as it dwells in human beings as radical evil, as a natural predisposition or propensity, cannot be eradicated through human powers. Consequently, the manner in which the good principle gains supremacy over the evil principle must appear incomprehensible, something that surpasses human nature. Here Schleiermacher's entire supernaturalist position becomes visible, although with an important difference. Kant reasons from the necessity of moral transformation and from the fact that the ethical inclination expressed even in fallen humanity through consciousness of the moral ought cannot be eradicated, and therefore concludes that such a transformation is possible. Schleiermacher, by contrast, regards everything that releases God consciousness from its bondage as something imparted to the individual, and consequently traces it back to the activity of the Redeemer. Yet because the entire antithesis within Schleiermacher's doctrine of sin and redemption is relative, and because its opposing concepts are those of one's own deed and what is imparted, as well as of God consciousness as powerful and powerless, capable and incapable of uniting sensible consciousness with God consciousness, the proper standpoint from which the matter must be understood repeatedly becomes apparent. What Schleiermacher calls an imparting is nothing other than the efficacy of the idea of the archetypal human being, insofar as that idea, according to its objective reality, is implicitly contained within human religious consciousness. When this idea is first awakened in the consciousness of the individual through the communal life founded by Jesus, its reality is nevertheless not simply dependent upon this origin in experience. The absolute as such can never be merely something empirically given. Therefore, just as Schleiermacher's general principle holds that what is supernatural is not something utterly supernatural, so what is imparted through the activity of the Redeemer is not something utterly imparted. It is also, in turn, something original and natural. We cannot connect some other concept with the capacity imparted by the Redeemer, because even the concept of sin, which corresponds to the concept of redemption, can scarcely be understood as an absolute incapacity. Schleiermacher explicitly maintains that the concept of sin is inseparable from the consciousness of sin. Therefore God himself is posited within self-consciousness together with the factor of sin. Yet the God consciousness is unable to permeate the other operative elements, and consequently cannot determine this factor of sin. God consciousness is indeed present, but it exists without power. Against this powerlessness of the God consciousness, that is, against the bondage of the feeling of utter dependence which constitutes the essence of sin, redemption appears as liberation. Redemption is the facility by which the God consciousness can be brought into view and infused into the various sensible stimulations of self-consciousness. But why should this facility be regarded as something imparted? The God consciousness is nevertheless always present and shows itself to be effective in human beings precisely because they are conscious of God. The state of sin differs from the state of redemption because, in the former, sensible consciousness prevails over and dominates the God consciousness. Yet just as sensible consciousness is always posited together with God consciousness, so God consciousness is never completely absent from sensible consciousness or reduced to nothing. Once God consciousness is understood as an active power, it becomes wholly inconceivable why it should not also become powerful to the extent that it permeates the other operative elements and gains supremacy over the sensible dimension. Schleiermacher maintains that it belongs to the original perfection of the human being to attain those states of self-consciousness in which the God consciousness can actualize itself. Thus the emergence of God consciousness has its foundation in human nature itself, and the fact that God consciousness, restrained and bound by sensible consciousness, must first be liberated from this bondage is simply a consequence of human development. For precisely this reason, however, this state, the feeling of dependence released from its bondage, and the facility by which God consciousness can be infused into the various sensible stimulations of self-consciousness, cannot be regarded merely as something imparted. Nor can redemption simply be based on the activities performed by the historical Christ. As Schleiermacher argues, if the suppression of the impulse toward God consciousness and its subsequent quickening are equally to be the act of the same individual, so that opposite effects must be explained by the same cause, then, in relation to the agent, those opposites can no longer remain opposed. Such an antithesis cannot exist if sensible consciousness and God consciousness are equally elements of the spiritual nature of human beings. That is, if they are moments within a spiritual development in which the same subject, insofar as sensible consciousness dominates within him, is a person in need of redemption, while at the same time, because he is never deprived of God consciousness itself, he bears within himself through this power the principle of redemption. The same circumstances apply to the idea of the Redeemer. Kant leaves no doubt that the Redeemer is the one pleasing to God, the ideal of a humanity pleasing to God. He is simply the personification of the good principle in its absolute victory over the evil principle. As the preceding investigation also shows, this is the actual significance of Schleiermacher's archetypal Christ. The archetypal Christ, the God-man, that is, the absolutely sinless and perfect human being, is nothing other than the idea of redemption conceived in a person. Yet redemption itself, insofar as it is regarded as realized in an individual, the God consciousness in its absolute constancy and power, is something toward which the God consciousness of the individuals constituting the Christian communal life can only ever be an approximation. This clearly shows that there can be no essential difference between Kant and Schleiermacher regarding the relation of the Redeemer to the individual, insofar as the individual is the object of the redemptive activity. According to Kant, the individual becomes one with the Redeemer, or Son of God, insofar as the human being becomes a new person in disposition or character, and unites in his disposition what in reality can only develop successively. For Kant, the Son of God as Redeemer, and therefore what is produced in the individual through the Redeemer's activity, the fellowship of the Redeemer and the redeemed, is simply the reception or acceptance of the good principle into one's disposition. To be changed for the better is to have the Redeemer within oneself, in the form of a good disposition. What is attributed to the Redeemer, therefore, applies in reality to the new human being, which is why Kant understands the vicarious suffering of the Redeemer as directly the suffering of the new person in place of the former one. Schleiermacher's doctrine of the Redeemer's activity amounts essentially to the same thing, since it consists in accepting faith in the power of the Redeemer's God consciousness. The Redeemer performs his act within human beings, and that act becomes their own when the God consciousness, which cannot be considered effective to any degree unless it is also assumed to possess absolute efficacy, gains predominance over sensible consciousness. In this way, God consciousness and sensible consciousness stand to one another as positive and negative, so that every increase of the God consciousness corresponds to a decrease of the sensible consciousness. The entire difference between the positions of Kant and Schleiermacher is simply the difference between ethics and religion. What ethical consciousness means for Kant, namely the moral order of human beings conditioned by the victory of the good principle over the evil principle, becomes for Schleiermacher the God consciousness, the religious order. What both have in common, and from which both begin, is nevertheless the absolute dependence directly posited in consciousness. For Kant, this is the absolute causation of the unconditional requirement of the moral law, whereas for Schleiermacher absolute dependence leads back to the absolute causality of God. Yet Schleiermacher's concept of God does not lead to an objective reality independent of consciousness any more than the absoluteness of Kant's moral law does. Schleiermacher completely excludes all objective determinations concerning the being of God. His concept of God is simply the indeterminate, abstract concept of an absolute and original causality, without which the dependence of which human beings are conscious would have no ultimate point from which it derives. This abstract concept is no different from Kant's concept of the noumenon. The concept of God, therefore, becomes a completely lifeless concept, a mere abstraction, which is why the being of God in Christ cannot be a truly living and personal presence. Schleiermacher's Christ idea, instead, completely parallels Kant's God idea. Kant's moral lawgiver, derived from the absolute moral law as its bearer, coincides with the idea of the moral order of the world, just as the archetypal Christ is simply the concrete expression of absolute God consciousness. Given all this, it is not unreasonable to maintain that, in its principal contents, Schleiermacher's Christian doctrine essentially carries out the antithesis between the two principles that Kant designated as radical evil and humanity pleasing to God. The difference lies simply in replacing ethical consciousness with God consciousness, together with the skillful but ultimately untenable manner in which the archetypal Christ is joined together with the historical Christ. In brief, the standpoint of Kant and Schleiermacher is the same standpoint that Hegel characterizes as the standpoint of subjectivity. From this position, all objective content disappears, and only what the subject posits remains valid. The subject alone becomes what is positive and real. What is highest is therefore no longer knowledge of truth or knowledge of God, because every objective content has dissolved into purely formal subjectivity. From such a contentless standpoint, genuine religion becomes impossible, since all content, activity, and living reality remain on the side of the subject. What remains on the other side is only a lifeless and empty God, a supposed highest being whose emptiness remains subjective and never reaches genuine objectivity. Kant had also extended the principles of his philosophy of religion into the history of religion. From his standpoint, Judaism was separated from absolute religion by the widest possible gulf, while paganism was not given the same treatment. Schleiermacher stands very close to Kant on this point as well, and Marcionite antinomianism has therefore found new advocates in both. Yet from a higher standpoint, this antinomianism is itself nothing other than a higher and more spiritualized form of Judaism. If Judaism is understood as the religion of antithesis, then every form of religious philosophy that leaves behind an unresolved antithesis ultimately stands upon the same ground as Judaism. For Marcion, the antithesis between the visible and the invisible, and between the law and the gospel, remains irreconcilable because he cannot understand the visible as an element of the invisible, or justice as an element of love. Despite its strong opposition to Judaism, Kantian religion is itself nevertheless a religion of law, because it can never eliminate the conflict between the individual and the moral ought, insofar as this conflict is essential to law. Moreover, as long as its Redeemer continually disappears into an inaccessible and distant ideal, the divine and the human are never permitted to become truly one. The same applies to Schleiermacher's religious doctrine. The absolute always remains what is absolutely over there, an abstract and contentless idea. Even within the self-consciousness of the Redeemer, sensible consciousness can never be completely harmonized with God consciousness so as to constitute a concrete unity.